Mirella Vasquez and Darion Cruz arrived in Sydney for a honeymoon they believed would start there forever, only for one of them to leave the city in a body bag, and the other trapped in a nightmare no newlywed should ever face. Mirella Vasquez never imagined her husband, Darion Cruz, carried secrets capable of destroying their lives, until a single trip to a quiet Australian cliff turned their dream honeymoon into a bloody international mystery. Darion Cruz stepped onto Australian soil with a hidden past, and Mirella Vasquez walked beside him without knowing she was seconds away from becoming the only witness to a tragedy that would shock two nations. Mirella Vasquez thought marriage meant trust, until Darion Cruz's secret associate, Selene Ward, emerged from the shadows and tore their honeymoon apart with the truth too deadly to outrun. Darion Cruz was supposed to be on the happiest trip of his life with Mirella Vasquez, yet before the week ended, his body lay at the bottom of a cliff, and a fugitive named Selene Ward vanished without a trace. Mirella Vasquez boarded a plane to Sydney with her new husband, Darion Cruz, but she returned home alone, carrying a truth so disturbing investigators are still trying to piece it together. Darion Cruz thought he could hide his past from Mirella Vasquez, but the truth followed them to Sydney, dragged them to a lonely cliff, and left behind a crime scene soaked in betrayal.
Mirella Vasquez had always imagined her honeymoon as a gentle pause in life, a moment where everything felt still and peaceful after years of rushing through responsibilities and expectations. Growing up in Quezon City, she lived with a tight-knit family that believed in simple joys and modest dreams. She worked as a pastry assistant at a small cafe, saving little by little while watching friends travel the world on social media. Every time she set aside a portion of her paycheck, she told herself it was for something special, something that felt deserved. When she met Darion Cruz during a friend's birthday gathering, she couldn't have predicted how quickly their lives would intertwine. Darion was charming, calm, always composed in a way that made people trust him with ease. He worked in the import business, at least that's what he told her, and often traveled for short trips she never questioned. What mattered to her was how he treated her. Considerate, attentive, careful with her feelings. Their relationship grew steadily, and within a year, he proposed with a quiet sincerity that left her crying tears of joy. To her, Darion felt like a safe harbor. Their honeymoon destination had always been clear. Mirella dreamed of Sydney ever since she saw photos of the Opera House lit against the water during New Year's celebrations. She imagined walking along Harbor Bridge, tasting food she could never afford back home, standing by the waves of Bondi Beach with her toes sinking into cool sand. To her, Sydney symbolized a world larger than the one she had always known, a place where love could breathe freely. When she and Darion finally booked their flights, it felt like a victory, proof that, despite life's difficult paths, something beautiful could still bloom. The moment they landed at Kingsford Smith Airport, Mirella felt a rush of excitement mixed with disbelief. Everything looked polished and vast, from the glass windows to the organized crowds moving briskly through the terminal. She clutched her passport tightly, afraid she might misplace something in the whirlwind of arrival. Darion walked beside her with easy confidence, guiding them through the airport like someone who had traveled far more often than he let on. He smiled at her every time she glanced at him, but the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. She noticed it, but convinced herself it was exhaustion from the long flight. Their hotel in Darling Harbor stood tall, with a modern glass exterior that reflected the blue sky as if it were part of the scenery. Mirella marveled at it, almost shy to step into a place so elegant. The lobby smelled faintly of citrus and clean linen, and the staff greeted them with professional warmth. Their room overlooked the water, and for a moment, Mirella could have cried again, not out of sadness, but out of the overwhelming sense of gratitude. She never imagined she would be standing in a place like this, holding the hand of the man she had chosen for life. She unpacked carefully, placing each folded shirt and dress in drawers as though arranging delicate memories. Darion, meanwhile, moved around the room with a distracted air. He kept opening his phone, then locking it quickly when she walked near him. When he thought she wasn't looking, he typed messages with sharp, deliberate motions. Mirella noticed, but pushed aside the thought with gentle persistence. She didn't want to ruin the moment. Not on their first day. Not during something she had waited so long to experience. They spent the afternoon exploring the nearby shops and restaurants. Mirella delighted in everything. The bakeries with pastries she had only seen online, the street performers who played violin by the water, the couples taking photos together under the fading light. She took pictures too, capturing Darion smiling beside her. But behind every captured moment, she couldn't shake the tiny unease that fluttered in her chest whenever she caught him checking his phone. That night, as the city lit up with shimmering colors reflected on the harbor's surface, Mirella sat by the window and watched the boats drift by like slow-moving fireflies. She imagined telling her family about everything she had seen, showing them the photos, telling them about the food and the weather and how surreal it all felt. Yet as she sat there, basking in the glow of the city, she heard the soft vibration of Darion's phone again. He picked it up from the bedside table and stepped into the bathroom without saying anything. The door closed quietly, but the sound carried weight. Mirella didn't move. She didn't turn. She only listened to the faint murmur of his voice through the thin door. Not the words, only the tone. It sounded tense, clipped, unlike the gentle warmth he always spoke with around her. She waited. When he emerged minutes later, he smiled at her, but she noticed his hands trembled slightly. The next morning, Mirella woke to the sound of seagulls and sunlight spilling through the curtains. She felt better, convincing herself that she had overreacted to exhaustion and nerves. She believed Darion simply needed time to settle in, just as she did. They had breakfast at a small cafe near the harbor, where she enjoyed pancakes dusted with powdered sugar. She laughed at the sticky syrup on her fingers, feeling her earlier worries fade. But throughout the day, Darion's behavior continued to puzzle her. He walked slightly ahead of her instead of beside her. He paused multiple times to check his phone again. Sometimes he stared at the screen with an expression she couldn't interpret, something between worry and frustration. When she approached, he slipped a device into his pocket with a forced casualness that grew harder to ignore. They visited the botanical garden, where she admired the sprawling green fields and colorful flowers. She tried to feel at ease, to lose herself in the scenery, but her attention kept drifting back to her husband, who seemed more preoccupied than present. She wondered if he was thinking about work. Maybe he had unresolved tasks back in Manila. Maybe something urgent had followed him into this honeymoon. By their third evening, Mirella found herself lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling while the soft hum of city life seeped into the room. She wanted to ask him, wanted to loosen the knot tightening inside, but she feared sounding accusatory or insecure. So she stayed quiet, hoping the feeling would pass on its own. Instead, the unease grew. On their third morning, Darion suggested they visit a more remote coastal spot away from the usual tourist routes. He described it as a peaceful lookout point with stunning ocean views. The way he insisted felt unusual. He wasn't the type to be fixated on specific locations, yet he talked about this one with determined enthusiasm. Mirella agreed, wanting to repair the invisible distance forming between them. Before they left the hotel, Mirella noticed Darion checking his phone again. This time, after locking it, he took a long breath as if preparing for something heavy. Mirella's chest tightened. She wanted to reach for him, to ask what he was carrying alone, but the words stayed trapped in her throat. The drive to the lookout was long, passing through less crowded areas and winding coastal roads that grew narrower and quieter. Mirella watched the scenery pass by, waves crashing against cliffs while birds circled high above. It should have felt peaceful, but the silence inside the car felt dense, like it was hiding something. As they approached the remote path leading to Rosedale Point, Mirella took a deep breath and told herself everything would be fine. They were newlyweds on a once-in-a-lifetime trip. Maybe the tension she sensed was temporary. Maybe Darion would explain everything soon. But deep inside, A quiet fear whispered that the honeymoon they dreamed of was unraveling into something she couldn't yet understand. And the truth waiting for them at the remote cliffs would change everything she believed about the man she married.
Darion Cruz had always been skilled at creating the version of himself that people wanted to see. To Mirella, he was a gentle, dependable man with simple ambitions and a warm heart. But beneath the calm exterior rested a maze of choices he had made long before he met her. Choices that followed him like persistent shadows. As their honeymoon began, those shadows tightened around him, inching closer every moment he tried to ignore his past. What Mirella saw as distraction was actually fear, a fear he struggled to conceal behind forced smiles and carefully chosen words. He had hoped that marriage would be a fresh start, a clean slate where he could bury former mistakes deep enough that no one could unearth them. But one person had followed the trail, and she wasn't someone he could outrun easily. Her name was Selene Ward, and Darion had once believed she was his gateway to a better life. They met in Manila during one of her art trading trips, when Darion worked part-time as a courier for a small import business. She was charismatic, confident, and deeply persuasive. She moved through the world as though she owned every room she entered. Selene collected rare antique jewelry, some obtained legally, others through complicated channels she rarely explained. She introduced Darion to opportunities that promised fast money, and Darion, eager to escape the constraints of his modest life, convinced himself he could handle the risk. What started as simple delivery jobs grew into roles he never intended to take on. Soon he found himself transporting pieces that weren't meant to cross borders legally, items whose origins were questionable at best. Selene paid well, and Darion used the money to stabilize his life, support family members, and build the image of a successful man. But he never understood her expectations fully. Selene believed loyalty meant complete devotion. She believed debts, financial or personal, should be repaid without negotiation. When one deal went wrong and a rare ruby pendant disappeared, she blamed Darion entirely. He tried to explain that someone else had interfered, but Selene refused to listen. She was convinced he had taken it for himself, planning to sell it privately or hide it until she lost interest. She was wrong about his intentions, but she was right to believe he knew more than he admitted. When Darion proposed to Mirella, he genuinely wanted to leave everything behind. He refused Selene's calls and messages, cut ties with people he had once worked with, and took a job with a small trading company to distance himself from her world. But Selene wasn't the type to let loose ends drift freely. She always found what she was looking for. Months passed quietly, until a week before the wedding, when Darion received a message from an Australian number he didn't recognize. All it contained was a photo, the ruby pendant held between gloved fingers, fresh scratches marking its surface. Beneath it was a short sentence that froze Darion's blood. "You owe me." In the days leading up to the wedding, Selene continued sending cryptic messages. She never threatened him directly, but the implication was clear. Darion would repay what she believed he stole. After ignoring her for months, Darion had clung to the hope that she would eventually give up. But Selene didn't lose interest. She only grew more determined. Her final message came the night before the wedding, when Darion's phone buzzed while he rehearsed his vows. It contained an address in Sydney and a time. The message read, "You're coming here eventually. Don't make me collect what's mine another way." That night, Darion barely slept. But he told himself he would handle it later. He convinced himself that Selene was only trying to scare him. After all, he had nothing left of hers. He had never touched the pendant after the night it disappeared. He didn't know who had taken it. But Selene never needed proof. She only needed someone to blame. When Darion and Mirella arrived in Sydney, Selene was already watching. She had connections in the city, dealers, collectors, individuals involved in discreet transactions. She knew how to track people silently, how to move unnoticed, blending into places where authorities rarely looked. Darion felt her presence long before he saw her. Every vibration of his phone made his pulse spike. Every unfamiliar number renewed the panic he tried desperately to hide from Mirella. He wasn't just afraid of Selene confronting him. He was terrified of Mirella discovering the truth about his past. On their first day, when Darion stepped into the bathroom to check his messages, Selene had sent a photo of their hotel lobby. Darion scanned it quickly, heart racing. It wasn't just a warning. It was proof she was close. Her message arrived seconds later. "You have until the end of the week." Darion knew exactly what that meant. She wanted a private meeting, and she also knew she didn't want a conversation. Selene wanted the pendant, and if he didn't have it, she wanted retribution. As Mirella slept, Darion scrolled through old contacts, trying to find someone who might know where the pendant had gone. He searched through old email chains and payment logs, hoping he'd overlooked something. But every trail ended the same way, with uncertainty and missing pieces. The pendant had vanished, and so had the person who had taken it. Darion had been blamed simply because he was the easiest target, and Selene never needed more than suspicion to justify her actions. During their second day in Sydney, Darion received another message with coordinates leading to a remote cliffside viewpoint, Rosedale Point. The message included a chilling phrase: "Come alone or she learns everything." Mirella's name was not mentioned, but Darion knew who she referred to. Selene always struck at what mattered most. He couldn't risk Mirella being caught in his dangerous past. That was why he insisted they visit the lookout. He needed a reason to bring Mirella close enough so that when he walked ahead and told her to wait, it wouldn't raise suspicion. He planned to meet Selene a short distance away, settle the confrontation, and return before Mirella grew worried. He believed he could control the situation just enough to prevent harm, but that belief was built on hope, not reality. Selene wasn't someone who negotiated peacefully. She acted with calculated aggression, and Darion knew it. As they drove toward the coastline, Darion replayed memories of every moment that led him here. The first risky job, the first illegal item he transported, the first time Selene smiled at him with approval, the first time fear replaced trust in their interactions. He wondered if he could have walked away earlier, long before meeting Mirella. Perhaps then he wouldn't be leading the woman he loved into the path of someone capable of violence. Mirella noticed his tension, but he forced himself to smile every time she looked at him. He told himself repeatedly that he could fix this. If he met Selene and proved he didn't have the pendant, maybe she would finally let him go. But beneath that hopeful narrative was a truth he avoided. Selene didn't care about innocence. She cared about dominance, power, and repayment. If Darion didn't give her what she wanted, she would take something else from him. When reaching Rosedale Point, Darion felt his nerves turn sharp and electric. The wind pushed against him as he stood near the edge, scanning the trails for any figure that didn't belong. He checked his watch repeatedly, waiting for the moment Selene would appear. His stomach churned with dread. He knew she wouldn't come unprepared. He also knew she wasn't forgiving. As Mirella admired the view behind him, unaware of the storm building around them, Darion's phone vibrated one last time. The message read, "I'm here." Darion swallowed hard. He didn't know exactly where she was, but he knew he no longer controlled anything about this meeting. Selene had chosen the location, she had chosen the time, and she had chosen the terms. What Darion didn't know was that Selene had already decided the outcome long before he arrived. She believed he still possessed the pendant, and whether he denied it or begged didn't matter. She was prepared to use force, and she didn't care who witnessed it. She only cared about reclaiming what she believed belonged to her, even if it meant dragging both Darion and Mirella into a dangerous moment from which neither could easily escape. Darion's past stood directly in front of him now, no longer hidden, no longer distant. And as the wind howled against the cliffs, he realized something devastating. He might not be able to protect Mirella from the truth or from Selene. The shadows he had outrun for years had finally caught up to him, and they were ready to pull him under.
Rosedale Point sat on the edge of the coastline like a secret the city preferred to forget. The rocky cliffs stretched outward in uneven layers, shaped by decades of wind and violent waves smashing against the shore. It wasn't a tourist destination for good reason. The ground was unstable in some areas, the trails narrow and difficult to navigate. To Mirella, it looked wild and breathtaking, a sharp contrast to the polished beauty of Sydney's tourist spots. She stood quietly, absorbing the cold ocean air, while Darion walked ahead with stiff shoulders and restless steps. She sensed something heavy inside him, something pulling him away from her even as he stayed only a few feet ahead. The morning sky was pale, with thin clouds drifting like faded wisps across the horizon. The waves crashed rhythmically below, creating a sound that echoed up the cliffs. Mirella hugged her arms against her body, not because of the temperature, but because her nerves refused to settle. She watched Darion as he scanned the trails to the left and right, his behavior edging into something far more than distraction. He checked his watch again and again, each motion more tense than the last. She wondered if she should approach him, maybe ask him what he was waiting for. But before she could take a step forward, she noticed something shift in his expression. His jaw tightened, and his eyes narrowed toward the side path that wound behind a cluster of tall, wind-bent shrubs. Mirella followed his gaze. A woman emerged slowly from the narrow trail, stepping into the open like someone used to moving unnoticed. Her presence felt instantly out of place in the desolate landscape. Her air of sharp confidence, her posture stiff, her expression unmoved by the gusts of wind that swept across the cliff. Her clothes were dark and practical, and the way she carried herself made it clear she wasn't here by accident. She watched Darion with an intensity that froze Mirella in place before she even reached the woman's line of sight. Darion's reaction was immediate. His shoulders tensed, his stance shifted, and he took 3 steps toward the woman as though pulled by a force stronger than fear. Mirella had never seen that look on his face, something between dread and resignation. She only knew this wasn't a friendly reunion or an unexpected encounter with a stranger. This was something far more dangerous. For a moment, neither Mirella nor the woman moved. The only sounds came from the waves below and the distant cry of seabirds circling above the cliffs. Mirella felt her palms grow damp as she watched the scene unfold, unsure whether she should join them or stay back. She didn't recognize the woman, but she recognized the way Darion reacted to her. This person was tied to the weight he had been carrying since they'd arrived in Sydney. This was the shadow he had been trying to outrun. The woman reached into her jacket and pulled out a small metal object. She kept it low, partially hidden beneath her coat, but Mirella caught a glimpse of its dark, cold shape. Her stomach twisted. She didn't need to see the full outline to understand the danger. They were alone at an isolated cliff with a person who did not come here peacefully. Darion raised his hands slightly, not in surrender, but in a defensive instinct. He stepped closer to her, and though Mirella couldn't hear what they were saying, the tension was unmistakable. The woman gestured sharply with the weapon, moving Darion backward toward the cliff edge. Mirella took a shaky breath as she reassembled the scene in her mind. Selene, the name that had never been spoken to her, but had clearly never left Darion's world. Mirella felt a sense of betrayal surface, mixing with her fear. She remembered all the times Darion stepped away to take calls, the late-night messages he hid, the constant distraction in his eyes. He had lied to her, even if she didn't know the details. But now wasn't the time to unravel emotional wounds. Something far worse was unfolding in front of her. The argument between Darion and Selene escalated quickly. Gestures grew sharper, movements more abrupt. Darion kept glancing back toward the ledge as if trying to gauge how much space he had left. Selene stepped closer, tightening the distance between them. Her face stayed calm but rigid, like someone used to making threats without hesitation. Mirella's heart pounded painfully as she watched them. She wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to stop the confrontation, but fear pinned her to the ground. Selene suddenly jerked her arm forward and Darion lunged to grab her wrist. In an instant, the situation erupted into a physical struggle. The wind made their movements clumsy, pushing at their bodies as they fought for control of the weapon. Selene twisted her arm, trying to free herself from Darion's grip. He pushed back, trying to redirect her away from the cliff. Their feet scraped against the loose gravel, sending small stones tumbling over the edge. The sound of rocks falling echoed hauntingly below. Mirella could barely breathe as she watched them wrestle dangerously close to the unstable ledge. Instinct finally overpowered her paralysis. Mirella ran toward them, her footsteps heavy against the uneven ground. She didn't think about the danger, only about reaching Darion before something irreversible happened. But the moment she approached, the ground beneath the struggle trembled. A crack formed along the edge, subtle at first, been widening with alarming speed. The shifting earth startled all three of them. Selene stumbled to regain her balance while Darion tried to anchor himself, but the gravel beneath his shoes slid like marbles. Mirella reached out instinctively, but she was still a few steps away, too far to change what came next. Darion's foot slipped first. His weight shifted backward as the unstable ground gave way beneath him. His hands reached out, not for Selene, not for the weapon, but toward Mirella. His eyes widened, filled with a mixture of terror and apology. Mirella lunged forward, her fingers brushing the edge of his sleeve for a fraction of a second. But the cliff won. The ledge broke completely, sending Darion plunging downward in a violent cascade of rock and dirt. Mirella's scream tore through the open air, swallowed quickly by the roar of the waves below. She collapsed to her knees, unable to process what had just happened. The love of her life had been swallowed by the cliffs in the matter of seconds. Selene took 2 steps back, her expression frozen, not in sorrow, but in calculation. She looked at the shattered edge, then at Mirella, and then at the trail behind them. She made her decision swiftly. Without hesitation, she turned and fled, disappearing into the shadows of the coastal path with the weapon still hidden beneath her coat. Mirella remained by the cliff, trembling violently. Tears blurred her vision as she stared into the depth below, where the chaotic waves continued their relentless crash against the rocks. She could not see Darion, she could not hear him. The silence below was absolute. Her mind spun with disbelief. She had come to Sydney for love and rest. She was supposed to be celebrating the start of her new life. Instead, she stood alone at the edge of a cliff, surrounded by the debris of a tragedy she never saw coming. The world around her tilted, unsteady, as the truth sank in. Darion had been carrying secrets, and those secrets had followed them all the way here. They had taken him from her in the most brutal way imaginable. She didn't know who the woman was, didn't know what they argued about, didn't understand the reason behind the weapon or the tension. All she knew was that her husband had died in a stranger's shadow, and the stranger had vanished. Mirella's sobs mixed with the wind as she knelt on the broken earth. The ocean continued roaring beneath her, indifferent to the life it had just claimed. For the first time since arriving in Sydney, the city felt cold, merciless, vast, and unforgiving. This was the moment everything shattered, and it was only the beginning of the nightmare that would follow. The hours following the incident at Rosedale Point blurred into a haze that Mirella could barely piece together. Her knees had refused to hold her weight for several minutes after Darion fell, and she remembered only fragments. The way her hands shook uncontrollably, the metallic taste of panic coating her tongue, the faint sensation of cold wind pushing against her as if urging her to move. She didn't know how long she stayed at the cliff's edge before a distant voice called out. A pair of hikers had spotted her collapsed on the ground and rushed toward her, unsure whether she was injured or in shock. The moment they reached her, everything collapsed into chaos. Someone ran to call emergency services, someone else wrapped a jacket around her trembling shoulders. Questions were asked, but she couldn't form coherent answers. All she could do was stare at the broken ledge where Darion had last stood, as if her mind refused to accept he was truly gone. When rescue teams arrived, they set up ropes and descended the cliffside with careful precision. Mirella watched from behind a police barrier, her heart pounding with fragile hope, even though deep down she knew the truth. Minutes stretched agonizingly long until one of the rescuers signaled from below. Their grim expressions confirmed what she had feared. There was no surviving such a fall. Darion's body lay on a jagged outcrop far beneath the lookout point. Mirella felt her heart break with a pain so sharp she thought she might pass out. Her breath came in uneven gasps as reality settled into her bones like a weight too heavy to bear. The police escorted her back to Sydney, taking her to the nearest station for questioning. She sat in a small, sterile room with bright lights that stung her eyes. Officers moved around her, speaking in soft, measured tones, but the words hardly reached her. They asked about the woman she had seen, the stranger who appeared from the side trail, the tense confrontation, the weapon hidden beneath her jacket. Mirella tried to explain everything, but the memory was raw and tangled. She described the woman's appearance as best she could. The officers listened, taking notes carefully. Every now and then, their eyes exchanged subtle glances that hinted at deeper concerns. As the hours passed, the shock dulled just enough for Mirella to begin processing fragments of what she had witnessed. She remembered how Darion had reacted, the strange familiarity in his posture when the woman appeared. It was not the reaction of someone encountering a stranger. It was recognition. Deep, fearful recognition. The question she had avoided during the honeymoon resurfaced, sharp and demanding. Who was that woman? Why had Darion brought her to such a remote place? What secrets had he been hiding? The investigation moved quickly. Darion's phone was confiscated, examined by digital forensic experts who uncovered dozens of deleted messages, many of them from the same Australian number. The messages stretch back weeks, their tone growing sharper and more threatening over time. Mirella was shown the printouts. She recognized none of it. Her husband had been receiving messages from someone named Selene Ward, exactly the name the investigators repeated with caution. Selene had sent instructions, warnings, and demands. Some messages referenced a pendant, others hinted at debts or unfinished business. The more the officers revealed, the more the life Mirella thought she understood began to crumble. They asked Mirella if she had ever heard the name before. She shook her head, stunned. She tried to reconcile the sweet, patient man she married with the person described in the messages, a man entangled in illegal, something dangerous. The police explained that Selene Ward had a long criminal history in Australia and nearby regions. She was connected to art smuggling, fraudulent trading, and several cases involving stolen valuables. Despite being investigated multiple times, she had always managed to slip through legal cracks, protected by her network and her strategic caution. As the investigators looked deeper into Darion's past, disturbing facts emerged. His passport showed travel records inconsistent with the work history he had told Mirella. He had visited Sydney multiple times in the years before they met, a detail he never mentioned during their relationship. There were money transfers from suspicious accounts, cash withdrawals made during strange hours, and communications with individuals flagged by international authorities. Each new discovery struck Mirella like a blow. She would sit silently as the police shared each piece of information, feeling her world unravel further with every revelation. One detective, more sympathetic than the others, placed a cup of water in front of her and spoke gently. He explained that they believed Darion had once been involved in a smuggling ring centered around high-value jewelry, pieces stolen from private collectors and museums. The ruby pendant mentioned in Selene's messages was part of an unsolved robbery from 2 years ago. Authorities believed it had passed through multiple hands, and Darion's name surfaced as one of the couriers involved. According to their theory, he had tried to leave the operation, causing tension between himself and those he once worked with. As Mirella listened, her eyes stung. She wanted to deny it all, to reject the idea that Darion had been anything other than the man she loved, but the evidence stacked against him, each piece more concrete than the last. The Darion she knew was only one layer of a person far more complicated, far more involved in secrets he never shared. But even as they uncovered his hidden past, another truth shook both Mirella and the investigators. Selene Ward had vanished. Her tracks disappeared shortly after fleeing the lookout point. CCTV footage near the coast showed a woman matching her description entering a parking area, but not exiting. Her assumed rental car had been abandoned hours later near a service road. She had gone underground, disappearing so efficiently that the authorities suspected she had planned her escape long before meeting Darion at Rosedale Point. With no weapon recovered and no eyewitnesses other than Mirella, Selene became the primary suspect in what was now being examined as a potential homicide case. Investigators believe she confronted Darion with intent to intimidate or possibly harm him, leading to the struggle that caused his fatal fall. Though the collapse of the cliff may have been accidental, her actions undeniably set the tragedy in motion. The media learned of the story quickly. Headlines spread across news platforms. Honeymoon tragedy at Rosedale Point. Filipino tourist dies in cliffside fall amid mysterious confrontation. Authorities search for woman linked to criminal syndicate. Reporters gathered outside the police station, hoping for a glimpse of Mirella. Officers shielded her from the crowd, escorting her discreetly into a private room whenever the media presence grew too aggressive. Mirella's grief deepened into something more complex as she learned the truth. She felt betrayed, confused, and angry. The man she had loved had lived a life built on hidden risks and dangerous dealings, exposing her to a danger she never imagined. Yet, even through the heartbreak, she found herself mourning him sincerely. She remembered the parts of him that were gentle and loving, the memories of laughter and quiet nights together. It was painful to reconcile the man she had known with the man the investigators described. The days following the incident passed in slow, heavy silence. Mirella was provided temporary accommodation while authorities continued their search for Selene. Officers checked in daily, updating her on progress, asking additional questions, and ensuring her safety. Some speculated that Selene might attempt to leave the country using false documents. Others suspected she would hide within the city, using her connections to stay invisible. As they dug deeper into Selene's criminal ties, more disturbing connections came to light. Several individuals in her circle had histories of violent confrontations, and authorities believed the ruby pendant had been involved in multiple crimes across borders. One piece of information chilled Mirella more than anything else. A confidential report revealed traces of someone else's blood found on one of Selene's belongings during a past investigation. Though the case remained unsolved, it hinted at the possibility that violence was not new to her. The more the police investigated, the clearer it became that this was not an isolated incident. Darion's death was one piece of a much larger, darker puzzle, and Selene was a central figure in it. The fact that she had escaped so efficiently only reinforced how dangerous she truly was. Meanwhile, Mirella found herself haunted by moments she couldn't erase. The sight of Darion falling, the sound of the cliff collapsing, the cold breeze brushing past her as she ran toward him. She replayed the woman's expression over and over, trying to decipher her intentions. She remembered the cold look in Selene's eyes, devoid of hesitation or remorse. That image stayed with her nightly, slipping into her dreams and turning them into nightmares. Despite her grief, Mirella cooperated fully with the authorities. She provided every detail she remembered: the angle of Selene's stance, the exact moment the ground cracked, the brief second when Darion reached out, trying to hold on. Her statements helped form the foundation of the case, guiding investigators as they pieced together the final moments before the tragedy. But no matter how thorough the investigation, one truth remained unchanged. Selene Ward was gone, and Darion's secrets would never be fully understood. What led him into Selene's world, how deeply he was involved, and whether he was planning to escape it forever were questions that would stay unanswered. In the days that followed, Mirella began preparing to return home. She felt hollow, burdened with grief and unanswered questions.
Mirella left Sydney with a fractured heart, but investigators remained determined to understand the full reach of the events that had taken place at Rosedale Point. The discovery of the ruby pendant had opened an entirely new direction for the case, one that pointed to a network far larger and far more dangerous than anyone initially expected. As weeks passed, the case file grew thicker, loaded with new reports, leads, and witness statements that only deepened the mystery. The pendant, now locked inside an evidence vault, became the key to unraveling what authorities suspected to be an international operation involving theft, forgery, and violent enforcement tactics. Back in Manila, Mirella struggled to rebuild her life while dealing with the emotional weight of everything she had learned. Each day brought new challenges, from dealing with grieving relatives to confronting her own questions about the man she believed she knew. Darion had crafted a flawless image, polished and convincing, and she had trusted that image completely. Discovering that his life was an intricate maze of criminal dealings left her feeling betrayed, naive, and uncertain of her own judgment. She often replayed that day on the coastal lookout, trying to pinpoint moments she might have missed, signs that could have warned her earlier. But every memory only painted Darion as the charming, hard-working man she fell in love with, making the truth even more difficult to swallow. Meanwhile, in Sydney, detectives continued to trace Selene Ward's movements leading up to the fatal confrontation. They found surveillance footage showing her purchasing supplies in the days before the incident and renting a small storage space in an industrial area outside the city. The storage unit contained nothing more than packing materials and a torn notebook filled with coded entries. Experts were brought in to analyze the writing, and although progress was slow, the codes seemed connected to names and locations spanning multiple countries. Investigators suspected the entries were tied to stolen artifacts, illegal transactions, and perhaps other individuals who had crossed paths with Selene and never resurfaced. As more evidence was uncovered, it became clear that Darion was not a minor participant in the underground trade. He had served as a courier and intermediary, moving items across borders by using tourist travel as a disguise. This knowledge did not change what had happened at the cliff, but it helped authorities build a clearer understanding of how he became entangled with Selene in the first place. The failed business deal was only a small part of their shared history. Their partnership had been forged through years of illegal transactions, and while Darion appeared to have attempted to distance himself from that world, Selene had no intention of letting him go without recovering what she believed was hers. Months after the incident, new information emerged when a Sydney resident reported finding a hidden campsite deep within a forested area near a national park. Authorities investigated and discovered remnants of food supplies, a burned tarp, and a metal box buried under loose soil. Inside the box were documents relating to stolen artwork, fake passports, and a fabric pouch similar to the one that previously held the ruby pendant. Although the campsite appeared abandoned for weeks, the items found confirmed that Selene had stayed there after fleeing Rosedale Point. Forensic teams discovered partial fingerprints on the metal box, but none were clear enough for a definitive match. It was evident, however, that Selene had been preparing for a long-term escape and had likely received help from individuals with experience in evading law enforcement. The case soon gained international attention. Media outlets in Australia, the Philippines, and beyond began to cover the story, focusing on the tragic death of Darion Cruz, the mysterious disappearance of Selene Ward, and the unexpected involvement of an ordinary newlywed couple in an international criminal network. As the spotlight grew, public interest intensified, and pressure mounted on investigators to track down Selene before she vanished permanently. Yet, despite multiple tips, reported sightings, and coordinated searches, she remained a ghost, always just out of reach. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a retired cargo handler from a small port in New South Wales. The man recalled assisting a woman who matched Selene's description onto a private boat weeks after the tragedy. She carried a single bag and left in a hurry, speaking hurriedly to the boat's operator. The witness had only decided to report the memory after seeing Selene's image on the news. Though the lead was old, investigators traced the boat and confirmed it had sailed to a remote island before returning days later, only with the operator on board. The operator denied any involvement, but inconsistencies in his statements suggested otherwise. Nevertheless, without concrete evidence, authorities could not charge him, and Selene's trail ended once again in uncertainty. Back in Manila, Mirella struggled to rebuild her life while dealing with the emotional weight of everything she had learned. Each day brought new challenges, from dealing with grieving relatives to confronting her own questions about the man she believed she knew. Darion had crafted a flawless image, polished and convincing, and she had trusted that image completely. Discovering that his life was an intricate maze of criminal dealings left her feeling betrayed, naive, and uncertain of her own judgment. She often replayed that day on the coastal lookout, trying to pinpoint moments she might have missed, signs that could have warned her earlier. But every memory only painted Darion as the charming, hardworking man she fell in love with, making the truth even more difficult to swallow. Months after the incident, new information emerged when a Sydney resident reported finding a hidden campsite deep within a forested area near a national park. Authorities investigated and discovered remnants of food supplies, a burned tarp, and a metal box buried under loose soil. Inside the box were documents relating to stolen artwork, fake passports, and a fabric pouch similar to the one that previously held the ruby pendant. Although the campsite appeared abandoned for weeks, the items found confirmed that Selene had stayed there after fleeing Rosedale Point. Forensic teams discovered partial fingerprints on the metal box, but none were clear enough for a definitive match. It was evident, however, that Selene had been preparing for a long-term escape and had likely received help from individuals with experience in evading law enforcement. The case soon gained international attention. Media outlets in Australia, the Philippines, and beyond began to cover the story, focusing on the tragic death of Darion Cruz, the mysterious disappearance of Selene Ward, and the unexpected involvement of an ordinary newlywed couple in an international criminal network. As the spotlight grew, public interest intensified, and pressure mounted on investigators to track down Selene before she vanished permanently. Yet, despite multiple tips, reported sightings, and coordinated searches, she remained a ghost, always just out of reach. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a retired cargo handler from a small port in New South Wales. The man recalled assisting a woman who matched Selene's description onto a private boat weeks after the tragedy. She carried a single bag and left in a hurry, speaking hurriedly to the boat's operator. The witness had only decided to report the memory after seeing Selene's image on the news. Though the lead was old, investigators traced the boat and confirmed it had sailed to a remote island before returning days later, only with the operator on board. The operator denied any involvement, but inconsistencies in his statements suggested otherwise. Nevertheless, without concrete evidence, authorities could not charge him, and Selene's trail ended once again in uncertainty. Back in Manila, Mirella struggled to rebuild her life while dealing with the emotional weight of everything she had learned. Each day brought new challenges, from dealing with grieving relatives to confronting her own questions about the man she believed she knew. Darion had crafted a flawless image, polished and convincing, and she had trusted that image completely. Discovering that his life was an intricate maze of criminal dealings left her feeling betrayed, naive, and uncertain of her own judgment. She often replayed that day on the coastal lookout, trying to pinpoint moments she might have missed, signs that could have warned her earlier. But every memory only painted Darion as the charming, hardworking man she fell in love with, making the truth even more difficult to swallow. Months after the incident, new information emerged when a Sydney resident reported finding a hidden campsite deep within a forested area near a national park. Authorities investigated and discovered remnants of food supplies, a burned tarp, and a metal box buried under loose soil. Inside the box were documents relating to stolen artwork, fake passports, and a fabric pouch similar to the one that previously held the ruby pendant. Although the campsite appeared abandoned for weeks, the items found confirmed that Selene had stayed there after fleeing Rosedale Point. Forensic teams discovered partial fingerprints on the metal box, but none were clear enough for a definitive match. It was evident, however, that Selene had been preparing for a long-term escape and had likely received help from individuals with experience in evading law enforcement. The case soon gained international attention. Media outlets in Australia, the Philippines, and beyond began to cover the story, focusing on the tragic death of Darion Cruz, the mysterious disappearance of Selene Ward, and the unexpected involvement of an ordinary newlywed couple in an international criminal network. As the spotlight grew, public interest intensified, and pressure mounted on investigators to track down Selene before she vanished permanently. Yet, despite multiple tips, reported sightings, and coordinated searches, she remained a ghost, always just out of reach. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a retired cargo handler from a small port in New South Wales. The man recalled assisting a woman who matched Selene's description onto a private boat weeks after the tragedy.